Patrick Hume. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us virtually, and thank you all for coming down this evening. What a treat it is to have Susan Elia McNeil back. It's been 3 years?
It's been 3 years.
It was way too long. But anyway, and exciting, this is, well, it's always exciting to have her, but Mother, Daughter, Traitor, Spy, dramatic cover, right? Is in fact a standalone book. It is not a Maggie Hope book. And Susan should tell you what the inspiration for it was, because after all, it's her book, not mine. So why don't you tell them about your last Maggie Hope and then that other interesting book you were telling me about at dinner?
Well, if you know Maggie Hope, the last book was The Hollywood Spy. And I used this amazing book called Hitler in Los Angeles. And I have to tell you the backstory of how I got this book. So my husband works as one of the Jim Henson Muppets. And I know, like, how does this all come together? But it does. Bear with me. And so he was doing the Muppets Take the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. And at the airport at LAX, he saw this book, Hitler in Los Angeles, and he thought of me and he picked it up. Now, you know, some women get jewels and some women get chocolates. I got a Hitler book. But I was so taken with it because I knew nothing about Los Angeles in World War II. I had no idea there was such a strong fascist, authoritarian Nazi component during the 30s in the Los Angeles area. And this book was incredible. And that's why Maggie went to LA. Plus, I think Maggie deserved a little break. Do you know what I mean? Like, our girl's been through a lot. And I do feel that it was good for her to have some like beaches and palm trees. But then there were these two women in Hitler in Los Angeles, which is a nonfiction book. It was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and everything. And there was a real life mother and daughter team, and they went undercover to spy on these Nazi groups. And they amassed so much information that by the time the FBI was finally interested, like meaning after Pearl Harbor, they were able to provide so much evidence to arrest and try 29 different men who were Nazi sympathizers.
Some of whom were German American or just simply anti-Semitic or right-wing. Some of them were actual Nazi agents, you know, who actually had...
Straight from Germany for the express purpose.
Right. Now, I grew up in Chicago, and I can remember, I'm a war baby because I was born in 1940, but I have no actual memory of Pearl Harbor or the rest of it. But I can remember there was a lot of conversation about interning Germans in the Midwest and whether they were, in fact, you know, Nazi sympathizers or Nazi agents. St. Louis, Wisconsin, you know, that whole area, I was just in St. Louis, and as we went by Busch Stadium, I'm thinking Anheuser-Busch, of course, you know, it was a very large German community there. And there was talk in other places about Italians. We're somewhat focused on the Japanese internment because that's the most obvious one, but there were in fact, one of the conversations I had with Jim Ben last night was, why weren't the Hawaiian Japanese interned? They were closer to Japan and therefore potentially more dangerous than the ones in California that were removed from the West Coast, but they were never interned, which I found fascinating. And in fact, eventually formed part of a brigade that fought in France, the Nisei soldiers, which is what Jim's book in part was about. Really wonderful book. So, you know, there are various ethnic groups, and then there was the whole communist thing going on, which after the war, as you know, fueled the whole McCarthy thing. So lots in play.
Well, that was the thing. The police, the LAPD, and the FBI were so focused on communists that basically these two men, war veterans, lawyers, and also Jewish, founded the spy organization. And what they did was they recruited people who were generally German American, Christian, It always helps if you're blonde haired and blue eyed, and as my characters are, and had those people go undercover.
Right. I mean, you remember the weathermen and all that. I mean, there was a lot of that activity after, in decades after the war. And I don't even want to think about what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment. I mean, a terrible reenactment of it, rigged elections and, people turning on neighbors and, that whole thing that came up, particularly in France, about who were collaborators and who weren't. There's been a book published about many of the upper crust in Britain who were basically more on the Nazi side than, and a lot of that was because everybody was so frightened of communism. And it was seen that, that fascists and, were a bulwark against what looked really terrifying, because the Russian Revolution and all had scared people to death.
Absolutely. But, there's something else to that. There is that, but there's also that in hindsight, history paints this beautiful picture of, Americans standing shoulder to shoulder after Pearl Harbor. And it wasn't true. All the fascists that existed before still existed. They just went undercover. They weren't quite as showy and flashy, but they were still there.
We were really lucky in our leaders. The Ukraine is really, who would have guessed that Zelensky could have, turned out the way he has. I am convinced, and most British people I know, that if it hadn't been for Churchill, Britain might very well have just given up. It took that kind of iron will and determination and inspiration. And really, FDR was able, until his health really failed in '44, but he was an eloquent speaker. And, so we were lucky in our leaders.
Absolutely.
If they'd been different, I think the war would have turned out very differently. Anyway, let's talk about the actual people. Well, why don't you talk about the Hollywood Spy? Because we did that on a Zoom event. So
we did.
Yeah, let's go back and talk about the Hollywood Spy and sort of segue into this one.
So Maggie Hope leaves London to go on a trip to Los Angeles, and she is she goes because her friend Sarah is a ballet dancer, and she's got this role in a movie, and it's very exciting. Big Hollywood break. And she runs into her ex-boyfriend, John, and he asks her to sort of investigate the murder of his fiance. As it turns out, she was his fiance really in name only, because she was a lesbian, and that was her cover. But she was murdered because she also was one of the spies who was working undercover for this Jewish spy master and going undercover in the Nazi organizations. And basically she was discovered and she was killed. And that's, so Maggie starts with that murder mystery, which takes place in '43. Mm-hmm. So this is actually like a prequel almost. It's Los Angeles in 1940. And so we see the mother and the daughter and the spies before Pearl Harbor.
So are you all familiar with the term lavender marriage?
Yes, that was the term I couldn't think of.
Yeah, I know. I saw.
I know.
Amazingly enough, I have an event coming up in October called the Lavender House.
Interesting.
Which is both male and female. I don't like the word queer, lesbian and gay people who are living in an estate outside of, I think it's San Francisco. I can't remember exactly where it is. But anyway, the Lavender House is for the same thing. So what is a lavender marriage? Because it really, there were a lot of them.
Well, a lavender marriage was a marriage between two women, and it was like not a legal marriage, but right. a spiritual marriage. And lavender was associated with violets, which are associated with Sappho and the Isle of Lesbos. And so purple is definitely a color long associated with the LGBTQ community, and lavender's definitely part of that.
There were people who actually were formally married, but it was a cover, so to speak, women or men who married people of the opposite sex, but in point of fact they were either gay or lesbian. And I always love this story, so I tell it all the time, but Hollywood was very much keeping all that undercover. And it was really the AIDS epidemic that that outed a number of prominent actors and so forth. One of them was Rock Hudson. But when I was a child, he was my grandmother's mailman under the name Roy Fitzgerald. And he was this kind of tall, skinny guy. And he delivered the mail from Kenilworth and Winnetka and so forth. And, you know, it was even hard to imagine how he bulked up and all the rest of it. But, you know, he and Doris Day made all those movies together. So everybody knew, you know, in Hollywood, but they never, so in a way it was a sort of a, not a lavender marriage, but, you know, it was,
Marriage of convenience.
yeah. And really it all changed with the AIDS epidemic and then when homosexuality was decriminalized. And if those of you who know anything about Bletchley and Alan Turing and his role know that he committed suicide despite his amazing work. They didn't give him any kind of a break. It was a really tragic story.
It is.
Yep. So I really hate to see us going backwards again at the moment and making life difficult for people. I didn't think it's the business of government what people do in their private lives. But anyway, we're in 1940 where that's what's going on.
Absolutely. Although, I mean, this novel, it has less to do with that. That was like part of the Hollywood Spy. That was a big part of the Hollywood Spy.
Right.
Less, this novel I think is interesting because Maggie Hope, I always think of it in like really bright colors and, you know, there are all the cameos and you get to meet Churchill and you get to meet Roosevelt. And then in the Hollywood Spy, you get to meet all these different celebrities. And with Mother, Daughter, Traitor, Spy, there aren't any.
Right.
This is exactly the way these two women who were very middle class would have lived. And, you know, the one joke I did put in the novel is, and this is true too, in Santa Barbara, Clark Gable's stunt double for Gone with the Wind and Vivian Lee's stunt double from Gone with the Wind had married, and that's where they lived. So Veronica, who's the daughter, and her mother, Violet, spot them, and they think they have a celebrity sighting. But then somebody tells them, like, no, it's the stunt doubles. So
very cool. Right. Probably ran into them at Musso and Frank, you know, see what was happening. So in 1940, France has fallen, but, you know, it's still not clear. Do you all know that we never did declare war on Germany? After Pearl Harbor, we declared war on Japan, but we did not declare war on Germany. Hitler declared war on us in what was one of his several major blunders, because the sentiment in America really was still against entering into the European war. If he hadn't declared war on us, it's not clear to, you know, looking back, that we would have leapt into it on both fronts the way we did. We might have just fought the Japanese theater for a while.
And in the book, you know, it's pretty obvious that the fascist movements in Los Angeles were really gaining traction and really gaining in power. And Pearl Harbor was a real game changer. And yeah.
Well, it was, but, you know, it was difficult to persuade people to enter the First World War, and there were, you know, a tremendous number of deaths. And then the whole isolationist movement in the 1920s in this country, with Senator Robert La Follette from Wisconsin was a big exponent. Why is it Wisconsin produced La Follette and Joe McCarthy? It's such a sort of benign state, and yet here we go. But anyway, and that was still, you know, we had to suffer through the Dust Bowl and the Depression, and America wasn't really interested in fighting another European war after the experience of the First World War.
I kind of get into that a little bit with, so Veronica, the daughter, who's 22, fresh out of college, is actually very much in favor of the U.S. joining the war. So she feels very strongly about that. On the other hand, her mother, who is not Nazi or fascist at all, is an isolationist, and she is someone who lived through World War I. She lost friends in World War I. She saw what it did to the America, and she has no desire to see the U.S. go back to war. And I think, like, I really wanted to present both of those points of view.
And I think by setting it in 1940, you know, you didn't trap yourself in the post-Pearl Harbor ethic here.
Right.
You know, so that was a good decision. It was still, we still couldn't see what was coming.
Yeah. Well, and it wasn't even a decision. I hew really closely to the real story. So the real women were Sylvia and Grace Comfort, and I renamed them Veronica and Violet Grace. But I tried to stay as close to their story as I could. And really, in some ways, it was great in that I didn't know much about them. There isn't much to know about their personal lives. We have birth dates and death dates and one marriage, and that's pretty much it. But I know them through their notes, which are kept at UC Northridge. And I went through boxes and boxes during COVID. A librarian who basically should be sainted, photocopied boxes upon boxes of original documents and emailed them to me.
Did she? That's impressive.
So, yeah. So I was able to really kind of go through in real time and figure out like what Sylvia and Grace Comfort were doing, and then how I could use that for Violet and Veronica.
So you created a particular group that that Veronica, think about it a minute, the daughter infiltrates. So was that based on an actual group?
That was based on an actual group. And I did provide really extensive notes at the end so that people who are interested can sort of like look it up and see what. But yeah, those were all based on real people, and they had some, like, you could just sort of tell like the relationships that they had. And so most of them have a pseudonym, but still he's pretty close to what was going on.
It's lucky they had such dramatic lives.
Yeah.
It's sort of like Shakespeare. I mean, he called much of the action in his plays from real events and real people, and then dramatized them. I guess Macbeth was some real Scottish chieftain, and I've always thought surely Othello wasn't real. That's my least favorite Shakespeare play, but I like to think there was no actual Othello out there, certainly not in Venice. But, why not? Why not borrow from the real world and, turn it into fiction? So you found things, your notes at the end are great, but one of the things that really startled me was there was an actual Hitler White House. They actually had prepared a White House in California. Where was it? In
the Pacific Palisades.
Right.
So on the coast, just north of Santa Monica. And it was built by a couple who were very prominent silver shirt members. The silver shirts were like the brown shirts in Germany and the black shirts in England.
Yeah.
And they decided Hitler needed a West Coast bunker, and they built it. They had architects' plans, and a lot of it was built, like 22 bedrooms and 22 bathrooms, and it was all sort of self-sustaining. It had its own power. It has its own water. It had its own. No, it's okay.
That was a scam.
Oh no.
Nice
Anyway,
ringtone.
they had like gardens and farms. Well, that's the thing. I hiked out to the remains. It does still exist, or the remains of it still exist. So there's like this ornate black iron gate that would have been, like where the road would have been. And then basically just the remains, the cement remains of like the structure, the foundation. Thank you. I don't know where the foundation. And now it's covered in graffiti. So you would have and you just have no idea what it was or.
But think of the hubris involved in actually, thinking about constructing on the west coast of the United States a place for Hitler.
Well, they assumed he would win the war. They assumed America would go fascist, and they assumed he would need a place on the west coast to meet with Japanese dignitaries.
Or maybe just go Hollywood.
Or
because he was. There's that whole Leni, what's her name, Riefenstahl. There was a whole kind of Nazi connection to the film industry in Germany and so forth. So maybe it was partly the lure of Hollywood that had that going on. But just imagine that. That was the one thing in the book that got me more than anything else, was this idea of an actual construction of a Hitler bunker.
And I can't even tell you how many people in Los Angeles didn't know and don't know. And that was like one of the craziest things too, was saying like, oh, hey, I'm going to hike to this like the remains of this historic site. Do you want to come with me? Like, what? So,
Well, it's lucky an earthquake or a mudslide hasn't taken it down, which it might still do. So tell us more about, because there's an actual story here. That's all sort of the background stuff, but what actually happens when Veronica, if you can tell us part of her story.
well, which part?
Well, just, what happened? They come there and she is on this mission. So,
Well, Veronica, so she graduated from Hunter College and she really wants to be a journalist. And she's accepted into this very, very prestigious program at Mademoiselle magazine. And, young ladies were housed at the Barbizon Hotel and it was very glamorous.
Was one of them.
Yes, absolutely. So many famous women writers. And she had an affair with a married man and got caught out by the wife. So she and her mother left in disgrace.
well, she got fired. I
Well,
mean,
yeah.
it actually took down her whole promising start because of the scandal. It wasn't a Me Too era.
It was not indeed.
Definitely not a Me Too era.
So she and her mother end up in Los Angeles where her uncle lives.
Right.
And then she's just, she's trying to get a job as a journalist. She's like, she can't get anything. And she ends up working for this quote unquote educational publisher. And this is all true, which was basically a front for a man and his wife. They were teachers in North Hollywood who put out propaganda and anti-Semitic tracts. And they were getting their primary information from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
German subs would come in to the harbor in Los Angeles, and there would be like handoffs of cash and propaganda and weapons and all kinds of things. So
Really scary, but none of us ever thought about, about that. I keep
Submarines
wondering.
in the Los Angeles harbor. That's pretty amazing.
I think it was more San Diego, but yeah, they would come in from Mexico.
Yeah, they could come through the canal, and right?
Yep.
I mean, we weren't at war, so they had that ability to travel. But I mean,
There are a lot of German Americans in the United States. A huge,
very large number,
very large population. So
and in South America too. There in Chile, in particular, there's an actual Bavarian village. If you sail around South America, one of the tour stops that you make on a cruise ship is to this whole province, a recreation of Bavaria. Which is, I mean, that's one reason that so many Nazis went to South America, aside from the fact that they could disappear more easily. But there were huge German settlements in Argentina and in Chile in particular, where they could go. But anyway, back to Veronica. So she's actually a trained journalist. I mean, she has investigative skills. And when she goes to work for this publisher thing and she becomes uneasy about what's going on, she and her mother try to get the attention of some authority, right?
They go through a whole, so they went to the police, LAPD, not interested at all. They went to the FBI, no interest, just interested in catching communists. And then because Violet was married, she was a widow, but she was married to a Navy commander, she looked up a friend of his, her late husband, who was in naval intelligence, and just said, hey, is there anything you can do? And as it turns out, he was, and this is true, this is all true, he was heading up the sort of spying on Japanese at that time. And he was very good friends with the man, Leon Lewis is his real name. In my book, he's Ari Lewis, the guy who ran the Los Angeles spy ring. So he put them in touch with Ari Lewis.
And then an admiral gets involved. And so, I really liked the admiral. He was great. But anyway, it was so hard. What's interesting is it was so hard for her to get anybody in any authoritative position to pay any attention to what she was telling them about, what these people were up to. And you're right. It was everybody was focused on the communists, and sort of not. Although, I think we should have been paying more attention to Japan. After all, the invasion of Nanking, what was it, Patrick? 1935, I think it was. It's a great book by Mo Hader about the invasion of Nanking, which is one of the most powerful war books I've ever read. But I mean, it was really obvious that the Japanese were a force to be reckoned with. I don't know that that we anticipated they would like leap the Pacific the way they did for Pearl Harbor, a preemptive strike, which again was really a strategic error for the Japanese because they hadn't done that.
Absolutely.
You know, everybody poked us. You know, that was so interesting. You know, here we are, the sleeping giant. The Japanese came and hit us with Pearl Harbor, and then, you know, Hitler decided to declare war, and, you know, they kicked everything into action. Then, you know, they might actually have had a very different result if they hadn't done that. So it's kind of like Putin going to the Ukraine. You know, you sometimes, or why did Hitler go to Russia? Why did Napoleon go to Russia? You know, I mean, some of the decisions that people make are so
Absolutely.
extraordinary, you know, and I don't know if they're based on poor intelligence or hubris. Yeah, I think it is.
Ego. I mean, look, who we had for president and what he wanted to do. Let's buy Greenland or something.
Yeah, I forgot about buying Greenland.
Yeah.
Right. No, it was interesting. The Danish didn't want to sell, so it was all okay. But
This Holocaust on PBS, they have this three-part
Yeah.
Holocaust thing about how it's not about the Holocaust so much as how America responded. And I think the reason that they were so interested in communists and didn't really care about what was going on with Jews in Europe was because they assumed communists were Jews. They equated communists with Jews, so they were the bad guys. So why would we want to help them?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, and that's true. And that, you know, I was reading something the other day about that it was many more Jews could have left Germany before things got difficult than did. But many of them simply couldn't believe that because they, you know, had businesses or they were professionals or, you know, they just couldn't imagine that that they would be turned on the way they were. And it was, you know, a great many people woke up too late to escape. My husband's family, the Rosenwald family, spent a fortune and enormous efforts to bring over as many of the family and so forth as they could. But some of them didn't want to come, you know. So it was a very difficult. But I think we also don't recognize how there was so much anti-Semitism in America and in Los Angeles. And part of that might have been really a reaction to some of the movie moguls, because most of the heads of the studios were in fact Jewish. And many of them ran their businesses in a fairly cutthroat sort of a way. So I think that might have been part of it too.
Well, I think, you know, there was a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of German fascists in New York too. But there was Fiorello LaGuardia, who was half Jewish, half Italian, and he kind of had a sense of what was going on more than anyone in the Los Angeles area. And I just feel like LA was, you know, first of all, so segregated. There was so much anti-Semitism and racism. For instance, Anaheim, California was then known as Klanaheim, California, because the KKK was so in ascendance. And it was just like a really sort of perfect storm of, you know, no governor, no mayor, no police chief, like, keeping an eye on what was going on with the fascist groups, and maybe even sympathizing with the fascist groups or thinking, well, that's a really good alternative to communism, at least. So,
well, you know, there's always that back and forth about, you know, enforcement and authoritarian, you know, defund the police, don't defund the police, whatever. I mean, none of this has gone away, you know. I mean, it's still going on all around us. And it's, you know, you look back and you think, why don't we ever learn from history? But somehow or other, we don't. We really don't.
well, I think it's because history is, you know, is turned into this myth. So, for instance, World War II, you know, it's this myth of World War II where Americans after Pearl Harbor all stood shoulder to shoulder and everyone was fighting against the bad guys and we were the good guys. And that is true. However, there were still all of these people who just sort of quieted down and went underground. So
That's true in Britain too. You know,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
had mostly in the black shirts and all. Well, you know, so there was no, you know, history's always written by the winners. I mean, it always is. And so there's some gloss, but I've always kind of enjoyed the fact that, you know, because Richard III gets such a bum rap from Shakespeare. I mean, it's really, you know, first thing we'll do, we'll kill all the lawyers and Crookback Dick and the whole bit. And I thought, you know, that was really just Shakespearean propaganda. And then they dug him up in the parking lot and discovered that he actually was had a serious spinal, whatever it is, and, his bones were crooked and the whole bit. And so, maybe Shakespeare was closer to the truth than, than we knew. But you're right, there is a mythology that settles over the winners.
And same in England, with Churchill and like everyone on the little island bonded together. It's like, no, there were actually still British fascists who were out and about. And actually, in the new Maggie Hope novel, which is set in 1943, 1944, Maggie goes to Madrid to meet with Coco Chanel, who's legitimately a Nazi agent. I mean, this is all historically proven, because Coco Chanel thought she could broker a separate peace for Germany with Britain. And it sounds so outlandish. And in fact, it took me so long to research this because I just couldn't quite get my head around it. But there were still so many people who were worried about communism, worried about Russia, taking over Germany and Europe, and really thought brokering a separate peace and keeping, not Hitler, but, like some of the others in power would be a better alternative, even in 1943. And no one talks about this.
She was a collaborator that survived. Many of them did not, or didn't get away with it, but she managed to. In all of this conversation, we haven't really talked about, this is a really good story. It's not history. And I really did think that, the story about Veronica and her mother and the dangers, the setup that we've talked about, and then the dangers they faced with this infiltration and, what they tried to do. There's a tragic murder. There's other stuff that happens. So this is, it's a novel. It's not history. But the background of it is great. And the other thing, it always is, maddening when we're talking about a brand new mysteries. We can only talk about part of it, maybe 10 minutes before spoilers. So that's why we digress all around and talk about other stuff. It'd be a very short program.
I will say one of my favorite parts was writing about Veronica and Violet and their relationship and how it does evolve. Because, as you can understand, like when it came out that Veronica was having this affair with a married man, her mother was none too pleased to be moving to LA. They had to really work to repair their relationship. And then when they were working as spies, they really had to depend on each other, and that changed their relationship too. And then Violet went from, being a widow and being an empty nester, to living with her daughter, working with her daughter, and basically being a badass. So, yeah.
Right. It woke her up because she'd actually been, she had been in grieving seriously from her husband's death. And so she was in kind of a no man's land there from grief. And this does, in fact, restart her life. It's a reboot for her.
And she's also doing all this incredible work while trying not to show that she's having hot flashes. So I don't know about you guys, but I've never really seen that happen in fiction before. So.
Right. So you've mentioned that there will be a new Maggie Hope. Is that the book for next year?
Yes, that will be the book for next year.
You're working on it? You've written it?
No, I'm working on it. I'm researching it, and I've started writing it. And so it's Maggie goes to Madrid to meet with Coco Chanel, and we will see John again. We will see her old boss from MI5, Peter Frayne. I don't know if anybody remembers him, but he definitely is important, and he comes back. And we will see Maggie's mother.
Ooh.
Yes, she is coming back. So,
that's
interesting
always
stuff.
exciting. It's always good to know that there's another book coming, right? So you don't want to leave here worrying about it. So how about questions? Any of you? Yes, sir.
There are a lot of myths about the losers too.
About what?
About the losers of the stuff like that. For example, everybody in Nazi Germany was together, and there's quite an active spy network. At least 3 major attempts to kill Hitler. There'll be Jewish involvement in, especially before.
Sure. There's the whole Admiral Canaris story, and there were. And, once again, there was luck involved. He could have been killed a couple of times.
Oh, many times.
And, and then you have to ask yourself, even if that were true, whether it would have really derailed everything, because there were other, you had a whole chain of command with Himmler, and well, Heydrich died in what, 43 in Prague, wasn't it? And there was that awful reprisal thing. But and I mean, that's the question we're looking at with Putin. I mean, if the Russian, there's a whole hardline group of Russians, and so just losing Putin might not solve the problem that we have, or not we have. Well, we do have it.
I do have one book question. Do you ever, if the book is done and finished, as you go around talking to people, people have questions, they have comments. Are you ever struck by something that somebody said that you wish, looking back, maybe you would include it in the book, or
Oh, sure. I don't think any major changes, but people have such thoughtful, interesting things to say, and I love hearing what people have to say about those kinds of things, because they really have great opinions. They really mourn characters' deaths, and they really have, people have some very strong opinions on who Maggie should or should not end up with. So, I've gotten a lot about her love life, and I love taking it all in.
I think it's important to remember that every one of us reads a book differently. Your reaction to the Maggie Hope will be different than somebody else's over here. And I, over 33 years on October 3rd, watched authors be amazed at some of the things that readers have interpreted or taken out or are questioning and so forth. But there was a wonderful writer named Robert Eversys who said a truly great thing, and I quote it from time to time because it's so true. He said, every book exists in three parts. There's the book that the author conceives and intends to write, and it's perfect, right? It's absolutely perfect.
Oh, the Chanel book, totally perfect, because it's all still up there.
Then there's the book the author actually writes and publishes, which, various factors go into, like deadlines and, length of the book and whatever it all is. But the third iteration is the book that every single person reads. Right. And, that's why book clubs are interesting, to have people come together and talk about what they got out of a book or disagree with it, So I think as an author, it must be fascinating for you to get that kind of feedback.
I love it. It makes them feel so alive to me. Like when people really start to talk about, so with Maggie's mother, like and it's great. It reassures me that,
You're connecting.
It's all connecting and people care.
When you read so many books, how many Maggie Hopes are there now?
There are 10 so far.
So I've read all 10, and I'm sure many other people have. You actually have a whole world of her life that you've created from your creation, and you're right that your preconceptions, each book, like where's it going to go? So yeah, she has a life with every one of your readers, which is very far out. I realize.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
And it is cool, but let's remember too that for every book an author writes, the universe both expands and narrows, because you can't undo the things that you previously said. She can't be older or shorter or, all those other things. So
exactly. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in the day of soap operas, they could forget things. People could, if you were watching like The Guiding Light,
right,
something could happen and be like, oh no, we never did that. You don't remember that. Anyway, I just thought that was so funny.
So it's hard to keep up with that. I know when Kent Kruger at BoucherCon a couple of weeks ago in his interview, somebody asked, because he's done 18 Cork O'Connors by now, if he had a Bible, so he could remember all the things about all the characters and all that he had already written. And he said no. And he had to go back and reread his own books. But he said, if I get it wrong, I will hear from, And so really, if you think about it, the best resource an author probably has in a moment like that is just to put it out there and ask your fans, many of whom may know your books way better than you do by now.
I'm very lucky in that I have a reader who's been with me from the beginning, and she's sort of like my history keeper.
You are lucky. Yeah.
I feel very blessed. She's wonderful, and she sort of helps edit, and she's just like that continuity editor that I think everybody needs who's on a series.
Super. Another question? Anybody? Patrick, anything from the audience? It's Friday night. People are out doing other things, but they'll come to life tomorrow. Seriously, none of you have another question?
Well, I just have a comment. When I heard that the title involved mother and daughter, I thought we were really going back to Maggie's mother, and that,
Ah.
I thought that's where it all came from. So I'm kind of glad we're going in a whole different avenue for this, but you're going back to Maggie.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. So I would say there would be at least minimum of 3 more Maggie Hope novels. And it will touch on her mother, but this is such a different, this is a mother and daughter who love each other, who've grown up together. They have sort of a normal bickering relationship that isn't perfect, but is full of love. Whereas Maggie and her mother, that's just a whole
Well,
different.
it's totally unique.
Yeah.
It really sounds good.
Yeah.
But if you had not written The Hollywood Spy, you would probably not have written this book.
Oh, probably not.
You know, so I mean, it's interesting that some stories don't fit the series. You know, I mean, that's where you are. You can't really, this can't really be a Maggie Hope book.
Did you take a holiday from Maggie to write this, or did this just come now because of the impetus from the other book you?
Oh, it was definitely from reading the book Hitler in Los Angeles, and I could not get that mother and daughter out of my head, and I just thought it would make such a great book, and I couldn't believe no one did it before me. Like I just kept looking around, like, are you sure? Like,
It's like a PhD candidate saying, "Please, nobody take my topic."
exactly. Don't
Right?
take my thesis dissertation.
Yeah,
So,
but it isn't a Maggie Hope story.
no,
No, I mean, it just, you know.
but it is the same universe.
Yeah, no, it is. Exactly. No, I mean, you are in the war and in the whole bit, but you couldn't force Maggie out of Maggie's world to do this particular job.
Someone in this novel has a photograph of someone, I'm not going to spoil it, but from the Maggie Hope universe. So there's like, they exist together.
A little Easter egg for
Yeah,
you.
it
fans.
is a little Easter egg.
I love that.
So
It's so much fun.
there are no relatives of the real women that you could find?
No,
How interesting.
no,
So the daughter never married?
no. She never had children, never
and
married.
the uncle didn't have children?
No. Oh, the uncle is fabricated.
Oh, he isn't real. Okay, because I'm thinking, wouldn't they love to read this book about their relative?
No,
there's
I've
nobody.
searched so
Yeah.
hard. If somebody comes out, I mean, if there's someone out there, I would love to hear from them. But yeah.
And you might flush them out with
Maybe.
this book, you know, it's very
Yeah.
possible. Did you have a question?
I do. There's so many movies now being made from books. Would you ever consider having a movie made, or
Oh, I would love that.
would you? love
Do you
that?
know someone?
Netflix series.
Does anybody know Reese Witherspoon? Because I think she'd be a great mother.
Or
Maggie
even the
Hope.
Maggie Hope series.
Yeah, the
Oh.
Maggie Hope series
Like
would be,
Netflix.
most of the people who are interested in doing serial television are looking for a series, you know, not just
Yeah.
a single book. Because
the
then
hard
there's more
part is
material.
that the writers for the movies don't necessarily follow the book very closely. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that can be disappointing. I know for some authors it is.
Well, I would be delighted to have any of my works made into TV shows or movies.
It's different storytelling, and I think you have to resign yourself to that as an author. That Dutch Leonard said it really well, Elmore Leonard, and he said, you know, what was my car, I drove it, and then I sold it, and they get to drive it. And I thought that was a really good way of, looking at it.
Sometimes the author can be the screenwriter too.
Very seldom. Authors are not encouraged to participate in the filming, or they really not. You know, people get together, they have writers' rooms, the whole thing. I mean, I'm sure your husband working in the Muppet world will know how it's a committee.
Yeah.
It's a committee world. It's not a single person world.
Well,
Not
Maggie
now,
Hope has
anyway.
been in development for, I think, 10 years, and nothing's ever actually come out of it. So
Yeah.
I've watched this process with multiple pilots and multiple producers. It's still actually technically under contract with Warner Brothers. So there is still hope, although it's been quite
No
a
pun
while.
intended.
So no,
But you
right.
never know. What you need is somebody, a star or something, to want to attach to
That's
it
right.
and to really like it. I think actually this would make a movie. You know, not serial television, but this one could actually be contained in a very interesting 2-hour movie. So maybe something like that will happen.
hope
The
so.
other thing is, if you ever get one made that's successful, then everything you do, look at Anne
That's
Cleves.
true.
I mean, she's got like, 3 series going on, or Mark Rainey, who got The Gray Man made, and now they're doing this or that. And, there's a lot of luck involved in it that you get somebody
You can also
attached.
send this book to people, like somebody reads the stuff. I mean,
Well, they're Hollywood agents. I mean, most
Yeah,
literary agents
So,
have,
you know,
have a
there's
Hollywood agent attached, and that's their
degrees of
job.
separation that way. Somebody will read the book. It's really
How about a puppet Maggie?
I think it's
A
good.
Muppet puppet, Maggie.
Those worlds should be separate.
Do you think so?
For domestic harmony, probably is the better idea, right?
I have a question for one of our online viewers.
Okay.
Sure.
It's, are you a plotter or a pantser? as they-
Oh, well, just to explain, so that person means are you a person who outlines a plot, or do you fly by the seat of your pants? And it's funny because I did a talk with Mariah Fredericks, who
Yeah.
writes the Jane Prescott mysteries, and we figured out that I was a plantser because I make elaborate outlines and like all these crazy, different things, and then I just sort of don't pay any attention to it. So
But that's not totally true, because having done the outline, you have actually in your head.
I guess so, yeah.
No, I mean, you really have. Even if you don't follow the outline, you've had to think about
Yeah.
it. You're not just plunging in with absolutely no idea what you're doing.
Oh, but back to the viewer. This one was far more of a plotter
Yeah.
book because of the
You're
actual
following
history.
real life. Yeah.
Does the eugenics movement fit into it at all?
It's mentioned. I mean, it's not a huge part, but it's part of that whole sort of.
Hollywood was thick with Germans.
Yeah.
In the 30s, wasn't
Oh, yeah. Many of whom had left Germany, like Marlene Dietrich, and I can't even remember there's some serious directors. There's an Eric somebody,
it? Fritz Lang, of course.
Fritz Lang, is it Strandheim? Do I have that right?
Eric von Stroheim.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Leni Riefenstahl.
Leni Riefenstahl.
Yeah.
But she was German. She didn't move to the United States.
No, she didn't. And don't forget that Berlin in the late 20s and 30s, if you think about Liza Minnelli, come on, what's the
Cabaret.
Thank you. It was a huge cultural, there was a ton of stuff going on in Berlin, in film and in art and furniture design. I can't remember what all. I mean, it was a real sort of like Vienna before World War I was a huge creative sea of creative people. And so Berlin was too. So there was a lot of film and all. And some of them came to America not fleeing the Nazis or anything, but just to get involved in American film,
Mhm.
And then if they were smart, they stayed.
One of the plots actually is that these people, and this is absolutely factual, they targeted a bunch of Jewish movie producers as well as people who were supporting them, like Charlie Chaplin, so Louis B. Mayer, and they were all threatened. There was a plan to assassinate them, all of them. Yes.
A purge.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was. Yeah. It was a wild
Yeah.
time.
Speaking personally, I'm glad to see that the services you could have chosen, you chose the Navy.
Oh, are you a naval man? Well, thank you for your service, sir.
Provided he doesn't turn out to be a bad guy.
No, the Navy men are the good guys.
They are the good
They are all the good guys. Yeah.
And California is kind of a natural place for that, San Diego in particular, for Navy guys, and Los Angeles, so for sure. Anything else there, Patrick?
Just a comment. Let's see, Jel, J-E-L, I think it's. She says, I wonder if now we are getting to the time where the losers will be able to have their side around more prevalent now that we live in an electronic world. Possibly.
An interesting thought.
Yeah.
The history of this time will necessarily be different, as we're finding out on a daily basis.
Yeah, Barbara and I were talking about that over dinner.
Yeah, it is. Records are different. Right. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming this evening.
Thank you.
I do have, as I usually do, a giveaway. And I have to brag for a moment. I'm going to do a moment's brag. Are you turning off the camera? Please turn off. Yep, that'll be good because I'm going to tell this story. Thank you all. Good night. Right. So when Delia Owens, thank you, when Delia Owens published